another meeting taking place quite close by, in which we're hearing the conventional wisdom. And so over the road, we're still hearing about the need to end import restrictions, we're still hearing about the need to avoid subsidies, we're still hearing the conventional wisdom of the kind that is produced, strangely enough, by a Labour Party, because what it's really doing is digging further still the foundations of the market system. And so, while I appreciate a lot of the things that Hilary Benn, who's a sensible, nice man, is saying today across the road, when I mentioned those three things I mentioned to you, about ending import restrictions and subsidies, going for fairer international trade, one says, do you know what you mean? Are you really thinking this through properly? Or are you having yet another go at supporting a system of economics, a system of agriculture, which doesn't really, in the long resort, really work?
About 5,000 farms a year going out of business. The average UK farm profit is 15,000 a year. 30% of UK farmers are on less than minimum wage. In the 1970s, the total profits of UK agriculture were around 7 billion a year, all through the 70s. The total profit of UK agriculture has never been over 2 billion since 1997. The cost of cleaning up nitrate fertiliser, another interesting stat, which is over 30% of the fossil fuel input into agriculture, was £1.8 billion last year. And someone said earlier about cheap food. We aren't eating cheap food. We're just paying huge amounts in taxes, which are then distributed to people according to the number of acres they own at the moment. And that is far, far greater than the whole profitability of UK agriculture. At the same time, I think the elephant in the room is this, that the supermarkets have gone, Tesco's, from making a few hundred million to 2 billion, I think, in the UK last year. And you can see a simple transfer of wealth from A to B. Now, as someone who's played around with businesses, any business that has one customer, especially a corporate customer, not a personal relationship, and those customers, and Tesco are on record of saying that they should not be able, supermarkets, take the name out, that they should not be stopped from retrospectively changing contracts with farmers. And, you know, you've got businesses which are slaves, and a lot of them daren't talk out. So the state of UK farming is obviously desperate, and business as usual is nuts, because this has been going on for a lot of years. 44 of my years, when I was born, every single member of my family was farming. By 1989, not one was.
Very important report that came out last summer by none other than the chief scientific advisor to DEFRA, and this was this IASTD study, a global study involving 400 scientists where they looked at current agricultural technology. And while accepting that high input monocultures had indeed produced more food per person on the planet, there were many downsides. Principally, that the benefits had been very uneven, and for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, 50% of the population is still hungry now as it was 20 years ago. Secondly, the emphasis on yield had damaged sustainability, and something like 1.9 billion hectares of land is now damaged as a result of the inputs that go on the land. And what I found a shocking figure, 70% of freshwater use is for irrigating crops. And a lot of this is damaging in the sense it produces salinisation and loss of water supplies. And this is a time when 1.6 billion people live in water scarcity. And of course, it's heavily dependent on fossil fuels. And the recommendations of that report, which after all were from the chief scientific advisor to DEFRA, is that, to summarise, we need to look at agroecology solutions to the problems and not persist with the failed high input system.
Everyone in the world could be very well fed. And I mean everyone who is ever likely to be born well fed to the highest standards both of nutrition and of gastronomy. And what we need is not only a new economy, but a totally new approach to what an economy really is. Because you shouldn't, instead of starting with the economic dogma and the ideology, You should start with asking what's good, what's necessary, what's possible, and then having worked out those things, you then devise the economy which ought to be in your own control. And that is the basis of what I like to call enlightened agriculture, agriculture that is actually designed to feed people. You look basically to nature. You say that nature has been productive and sustainable and resilient, incredibly resilient, for the last 3.8 billion years. And okay, farms are an artifice, an artificial thing that we have created, but nevertheless, why don't we use nature as a model and emulate nature? And then just ask how nature does it. And nature does it, first of all, by being tremendously diverse, and secondly, by using absolute minimum of inputs. The only inputs into a natural ecosystem are those that are generated by the system itself.
There are all sorts of things that are wrong with monoculture, but I'd just like to very quickly give you 2 or 3 examples. I worked for many years with cereal powdery mildew when I was working at the Plant Breeding Institute. This disease, when it occurs in, or as it occurs in the natural world, has evolved to become a total spore-producing machine. Under natural conditions in the wild, where there is competition and interaction with all sorts of other organisms, it's very difficult for that organism to reproduce. The success rate of these billions of spores that it produces is absolutely minute, but it's just enough for it to survive within natural systems. This means that when we have a monoculture and expose a spore-producing factory like this to a monoculture, the actual success rate of these spores goes up probably several orders of magnitude. Monoculture also, I think, and this is a really important fundamental point, is simply the wrong direction to go if we have to deal with multiple characteristics. By that I mean that particularly in a time of climate change, declining resources, variable systems of agriculture and so on, we need lots of different characters to deal with the complex environments that we have and which we produce. And in order to do that, monoculture, in my view, is not the right way to go. Just one example, the work of David Tillman and his group in Minnesota. They showed, for example, by taking the natural prairie grassland system apart, that if they separated out 16 species from that grassland system, they would get this kind of yield in tons a hectare per annum. But if they grew the system, the 16 species back as a mixture, you can see a 50 or 60% yield increase.
Food security is on the agenda, climate change is definitely on the agenda, and resource depletion, fossil fuel depletion, and other forms of resource scarcity also being discussed. The truth is, the inconvenient truth is that if we're going to respond adequately to those threats, we will have to take action of a kind which over the road they really don't want to discuss. A challenge that the whole of agriculture is facing, which we all have to embrace together. And part of that challenge, if we're going to farm sustainably, will be to have to move away from resource-consuming and highly nitrous oxide emitting use of nitrogen fertiliser to building fertility through crop rotation, which is what most farmers in Britain used to do until the Second World War, not all, because nitrogen fertiliser was available before then. Now, if we were to do that, that would involve the most far-reaching change in British agriculture, probably since the Industrial Revolution. How can we, who know that the situation we are in is extremely serious, and that the timescale we have is maybe 10 years, how can we create an atmosphere driven by informed public opinion, which will have to be the result of a very sophisticated discussion which will be led by the media, to enable the government, to enable all the government's agencies, and to enable the farmers themselves to go on this transition journey.
Well, my message, we could feed everybody well. We don't do it because the powers that be have got it completely wrong. They've got it completely wrong not just because they're market economists, but because they put the economy first rather than putting biology and morality first, and that we could take the whole thing over if we really put our minds to it.